Hello, welcome to my next video on the Specialized AI Training Preparation Guide. So we have done a lot of videos around document understanding, and this is going to be most likely the last video for document understanding for this guide. Next video onwards, we'll be looking into our next topic, which is the communications mining. So that's something that most of the people have asked for, and I think it's coming soon in the next video, so stay tuned for that. In this video, we'll just look at the document understanding template. Now again, we have a lot of videos around the document understanding template, how to use it and so on, but I just want to focus on a few things that you need to know, especially for this certification. So that's why we are doing this video on the template, and again in the next one we will move into the communications mining. So you may wonder why I'm not covering about the extractors, the training, the model training in document manager. It is because we have a lot of videos around those topics. We have separate series of videos on those topics. So I have the link for all those series and the individual videos we need to look into in the video description here. So you can refer to those. Okay, that being said, let's quickly get started on this template video. Again, I have a set of videos that I have done explaining several components of this document understanding template along with the digitizing part. But just to keep it simple, let's glance through some of these things. So in the framework, we have two options to start the process. One is unattended, the other one is the attended version. In both, we can start the process by giving the document as the input in different ways. One, if you are using the attended, you can select it from the file selection menu when you execute. The other option is use in the queue. The use in the queue method is available for both attended and unattended. For unattended, you have the queue. You don't have a file selection pop-up window because it's unattended, but instead, if you see here, you can get the document path as a argument from your main workflow. This argument will also be available in your jobs page. So when you're triggering the job in Orchestrator, you can probably give the file path and trigger the process. But make sure you need to set this to false if you're giving it as a separate file path so that it won't use the queue for that job. Okay, now coming to the template, read config file is just the basic the read configuration workflow that allows you to read all the sheets in the configuration file. Initialization process. Let's quickly have a look. This is all about loading the taxonomy, reading the assets, and getting all those populated into the configuration dictionary. Then comes the get transaction item. This is about getting the item from the queue and using it in the workflow over here. So remember, the template is using one job per document concept. So even if you have multiple items in your queue, it will process one job will process only one document. So we are checking whether the queue is used, and here we check whether there is a document available for us to process. It is using the in-target file, which is this argument name, and the get transaction item will actually update that argument name with its output. Here you can see in target file. So this is the file path that you get from the workflow. So you get two outputs. One is the queue item, the other one is the file path itself that is coming from the queue item specific content. And if you have the data, we perform the digitization, and that part is covered in a separate video. If you want to go into the detail, I have mentioned it here on the screen right now. And then comes the classification. So in the classification, this is about you're using the classified document scope and any classifier that you wish to use in your document understanding process. By default, you have the intelligent keyword classifier configured here. And by default, in the taxonomy manager, I want to show you this part as well. In the taxonomy manager, it supports different kind of documents. One is the certification of filing. The other one is a receipt and an invoice under semi-structured. For structured documents, you have a W9 form. So these are the documents that the template by default supports. And these are configured to work with those things. You can see. So if you want to add a new document, you can configure the taxonomy manager and use your classifiers accordingly by enabling it for the required classifiers. So the output of this workflow will be the classification results array, which we will be using as the data for the classification rule check. So this is about validation. So in the previous one, we extracted the classification data, and in the rule check, we check whether the data is accurate based on certain logics. You can also decide whether you want to always go for manual validation without checking your business rules. This setting is configured in the config file. So this setting is available in two places. One is in the settings sheet, always validate classification. Same goes for the extracted data as well. You can set it here. If not, if you are using assets, you can set it in the asset itself, and this value in the asset will overwrite the one in the config file. So just remember that. And then if you don't want to always validate, then it will apply your rules. The default rule available here is just checking the minimum confidence threshold. Again, this confidence threshold is mentioned in the config file. So you can see it here, you can get it from the asset itself. If you don't want to use the asset, the configuration threshold will be available here. So you can configure the settings sheet to do that. So this is what happens here, and based on this, it will decide whether to go for manual validation or whether it can be automatically classified and moved into the extraction part. If you need to go for manual validation, you have this next check to check whether the classification was successful or not. And if it is successful, you can see it goes to the second step where you do the extraction. If not, here we have a separate sequence. Now remember, this is not another invoked workflow. This is a part of the main workflow here because this this wait activity, the create activity can be anywhere in the workflow, but what I'm referring to is the create document classification action, but the wait for the action should be here in the main workflow. So just to organize this, they have put it inside this sequence. So it is mandatory to have all the wait and resume kind of activities in the main workflow itself. So this is how we use the Action Center for the classification, manual validation. And once you have the output of this, it goes to the data extraction part, which is our next step, process each document. And now this loop is actually a parallel for each. You can see this is a parallel for each. The reason, because your document, a single PDF can have multiple documents. So in such case, if you want to process those, you can't process them in a sequential order because the extraction will also require manual validation at times. And if you put it inside a for each, that's going to be a problem because if at all that goes to manual data validation in Action Center, your remaining set of documents will be on hold within this loop. And it's not a good practice. So the ideal and the best approach is to use a parallel for each in cases where you have scenarios like this, so that even if your document has multiple document types, you can process them parallel and you can send those to manual validation parallelly. And whenever those items are validated by the user, it will process that specific part of the loop and wait until everything else is done. But it will still process these steps for each document type. So you don't need to wait for anything. Okay, so here we do the extraction. An extraction workflow is all about having your data extraction scope and all the possible extractors depending on a requirement to do the extraction on different document types. So by default, you have the regex based extractor, you have the forms extractor for W9, and the ML extractor for receipts and invoices. Now you need to remember one thing. ML extractor supports semi-structured documents. But what if someone asked you whether the ML extractor also supports structured documents? Yes, it supports structured documents. Then you might ask, what about the form extractor? It is there to process structured documents. Yes, form extractor can only process structured documents, but ML extractor can support both structured and semi-structured. If you configure Forms AI, that model that you create with Forms AI will actually get connected with the ML extractor here. So Forms AI is to support data extraction from structured documents using AI capabilities. So that's why this ML extractor supports both. And also these extractors, especially the ML extractor, these use out of the box models that are already available in AI Center. So what are the fields the document understanding template support for receipts and invoices? It actually supports the out of the box. It actually supports all the fields that's available in the out of the box models available in AI Center. So that's the default setting. Okay, so this is the data extraction part, and the output of this will be the extraction results. The extracted data again needs to be verified depending on your document type. To do that, we need to first check what kind of a document we are processing based on the classification result and then apply the required validations based on that. So to do it, we have two steps here. First one is the extraction rule check. This is our next workflow. And down here we have several checks. We need to first check whether the always validate manually is setting is true. Again, just like I showed earlier, for it can come from the config file or it can come from the asset. So if we are applying the validation rules based on the document type that is coming from the classification result, you can decide where to go. And if it's the invoice processing, it will invoke the special workflow that is dedicated towards validating invoice data. If it's receipts, it will go to another workflow dedicated to validation receipts data. You can even include your own workflows depending on your document type here. So where can you find this? It's there in the framework, reusable workflows. These are the two workflows that we are looking at: invoice post-processing, receipt post-processing. And if you open this, again, these workflows will look for the fields available in the out-of-the-box version that's available in AI Center. So it always refers to those fields. So what happens here? I'll only look into one because receipts also follows a similar structure. The first thing it does here is it will take all the fields available for these specific documents into this document fields variable. So it's more like a dictionary. And then it will export the extraction results, and here it will get the values from the configuration file. And in the config file also you have two dedicated sheets to do this validation: invoice post processing and receipt post processing. Here you have the different validations we will be performing. So if you have any fields that contribute to the subtotal, you need to list those fields here. So in invoice scenario, these are the fields that will contribute to the subtotal. And the fields listed here goes in as mandatory fields. So you always need to have a value extracted for these fields. And these are the regular fields. Same goes for the column fields, and those things should be listed here. For the rest, if you also want to check against the confidence, those things can be listed here. So for example, you don't need to have a single confidence threshold for all the fields. The confidence threshold can depend based on the field and based on your validation logics. And that's why we have it like this. So whatever you list down under confidence fields, for each field you also need to specify the threshold. This can be the same threshold or different thresholds depending on your rules. And for other confidence fields that are not very specific with business rules, you can have a single confidence threshold, and you can list all those fields here and have a single confidence threshold just for that. So these are the checks we'll be doing in this workflow. So first of all, we will just get all those into variables so that it's easier to process. Then comes checking the mandatory fields. So here we apply several checks to check whether these fields are correct, and if it has a value, then it should also follow those specific formats. Like for example, if it's a date, it should follow the date format and it should be a valid date. It should not be any value. So we will be checking those special fields here. And then comes the mandatory field check. So in this condition, we'll be checking what are the fields that did not get extracted and mark them. We will also do a little bit of cleanup to make sure we remove special characters and unwanted spaces and so on, so that we can easily do the conversion. So for example, if it's a numeric field, we can remove We can specifically look for the numeric patterns and do the conversions easily so that it helps to do the calculations. So that's what happens here. You can see it removes the currency symbols and empty fields. And then comes the verification of the line items. So the line items will get extracted as a separate um, table within this um, extracted results. And you can actually go through this table row by row and check whether these fields have currency symbols like special characters and so on. And you can remove those with those regex patterns we created. Then we can check for the decimal places like what we are doing here. So that we basically bring everything into a specific standard. Then you can also apply the cross-validation logics like the subtotal additions and so on. So we can do the calculations using the line amount. You can get the total into a variable so that we can do the cross-validation in the next step. So this is all about preparing your data and cleaning your data to apply the validation rules. And here comes the rule check. So here we'll be looking into these things. Check if the sum of the line amount matches with the extracted net amount. And we do this check to see if the sum of the additional to the subtotal match to the extracted total. And we do several other checks as well. So this flowchart will be doing those checks for us and decide whether the check is successful or whether we need to go for manual validation. So anything that goes through manual validation will set this auto extraction to false so that in the next step we can create the action based on this condition. So this is all about this workflow. And once that is done, the output will go to the extract, sorry, over here. And based on this output, we will be doing the creation of the action in the action center. And again, this is a sequence because we are still in the main workflow. We are not inside a separate workflow, and the wait and resume activities will be here. Again, once you resume, you can also do the training for your extractors based on the manually validated data. So if the auto training is enabled, you can it will trigger this workflow to train the extractors, basically preparing the data and sending it to the action center, sorry, the AI center into data sets so that you can use that data to fine tune your models. This is only applicable for the AI models, for the or the ML extractor, in other words. Okay. And then once that is done, let me go back here. Once that is done, then final step is export everything into Excel. So in the export workflow, here it will create the Excel file, export the extracted results, and all that will get saved into an Excel file. So it's a simple workflow. So this is the main thing that happens in the document understanding template. But there is one more thing that you need to know. So we actually got to this point. And at the end, before going to those, let me just quickly close this so it's easier. So this is the last workflow in this. This is the last workflow file that gets invoked in this DU template to process one file. So what happens here? In this workflow, we have several things. We basically set the transaction status based on the result of the execution process. So depending on that, we can decide whether to set it to success or whether to set it to fail or so on. So this is what happens here. We can open it and see how it looks like. It is somewhat similar to what you see in the RE framework, set transaction status. So it is the kind of the similar thing here. If it's success, we execute this and set it to success. And if it's an error, we check whether it's a business rule exception or application exception and execute this sequence accordingly. So that is actually the end of the flow. But there is one more workflow that is hidden here. So this is actually in the exception part. So this end process is the normal where you end the process. But this whole block goes inside a try catch. And if at all this goes into an exception in here, it needs to have a way to stop the process. So that's where this exception workflow comes in. So there is this workflow called ERR abort process. So this is to stop the flow when you have an application exception. So if you get a question around what happens in the DU template when there is an exception, which workflow gets executed, it's this one to abort the process. So this is all you have here by default, but you can have your custom cleanup code in here if needed. So this same flow is available for Action Center and the attended version. It is the same thing, only difference is for attended you need to get the file from a file selection window. Other than that, the flow is exactly the same. I have a few more things to share about this DO template. Now you know about the flow. But over here, we have a few extra things. I want to focus on this test and this framework. In the framework, this is where you have most of these workflows that we looked at. But when it comes to the classification, training of the classification training for the keyword classifier and for the intelligent keyword classifier, it uses a JSON file. This JSON file is located in your computer, and whenever you have multiple jobs trying to execute this workflow, like for different files, it will try to train your classifier. Let's say you have three documents and all three got into manual validation. And now once you resume the process, it needs to update your JSON file with the training data, with the manually verified data. So if all three jobs try to access this single JSON file, it will run into an error. So how is that handled? It is actually handled by a set of workflows. So let me go to that specific place in our flow so I can show you. So in this place, classify this section after the training. Yeah, if you want to train your classifiers, this is how it will happen. First of all, we need to make sure this file is available to edit, and it should try to avoid the errors that can happen when multiple jobs try to access this file. The first thing that happens here is you lock the file. So this is similar to what we do with normal programming stuff when you try to access a file in multiple jobs at the same time. So here what we do is this reusable workflow, this lock file will help us to lock these files for this specific job. So it locks the file so that other jobs cannot access it and it will have to wait. So there is a timeout limit, and then it will try to do this training classification and then unlock the file. So what happens in this lock? So basically what happens is it will get the file and it will try to move it to a different location. So for example, see this. You get the classifier learning file path in the config and you add something called .lock along with the lock key. So that will be your new file path. And inside this, we have this loop, while loop. It will copy this file into that new location. So basically what happens is it's more like a renaming of that file. So you can see here, rename the current classifier file and wait for a second. So that's how they lock it. So once you rename it, you get that output, the new file path, and then you use it um, in your train classifier scope, that locked file name. So you update the renamed file and then you do the unlock. So what happens with the unlock is you change that file to its original state. So if the log file exists, you change it to the original file path. So it's again a renaming. And if that file exists, you overwrite it. So this is how they handle the locking mechanism of this JSON file. Sometimes you may lose some training data because of this approach, but the recommendation is it's fine to lose certain number of training data because still it will maintain that the training data within the file and it will not allow these jobs to try to override and corrupt the file. So this is one main thing that you need to know for the certification. So there are several workflows involved for this. One is lock, the other one is unlock to do this step. So that's the main thing about here. And then when it comes to the testing, the template also offers several test scenarios where you can actually test different components of this template. This includes digitizing, classification validation, extraction, and so on. So basically all those steps that we went through for the template, you can test it one by one. How many test cases do you have here in the template? So if you expand it, you can see this different icon. A normal workflow will look something like this with this UI icon, but this is specific to those test workflows. So we have different test workflows available. So let me just close this. I'm not going into the detail of each and every workflow here, but generally just remember that you have test workflows for get transaction, digitization, classification, the classification rule checks, extraction, and here you have certain extra workflows that gets executed through this test to compare the results in simple fields and also in the tabular data. It also is also available for the extraction validation to check your validation rules in invoices and receipts. So basically the same checks that we checked before with the mandatory fields, the confidence fields, and the totals. And then comes the export. So in total, you will see 19 test workflows here in the template given to you by default. To support that, you will see several extra workflows like this batch testing utilities and cache. So these are like supporting workflows for your testing. So this is the main thing that I wanted to share. And if you want to look into these specific test cases, you can have a look. I have done one for the digitizing as a separate video, which you see on the screen right now. But I'll try to cover the others as well in a different series, not as a part of this. But for now, this is what you need to know. And I think that covers everything about the DU template. And if you have any questions around the DU template, you can feel free to ask those in our WhatsApp group or in the comment section here, and I'll respond to you. But this video ends the document understanding specific content for this specialized AI workflow, for the specialized AI certification. And from the next one onwards, we'll look into the communications mining. But still, if you have any specific questions around this, feel free to ask. We can support you on those things. And if you have very specific areas that you feel that there's good to have some videos, let me know. I can create it as a part of this series. So that's it. And thank you for listening. And I'll see you in another video specific on comms mining. Until then, take care.